Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of DeskTalks. Today, we're discussing why the voice of customers still cuts through in a world of data overload. I'm joined by Josh Emington from the Martec Group, who works closely with companies to turn insights into the real strategic direction. Josh, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to DeskTalks.
Hey, my pleasure. It's great to be here and looking forward to discussing this topic with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll be discussing today the age of data overload, the voice of customer, if it still matters, from metrics to meaning, balancing the scale and depth when it comes to the handling large quantitative researches. So we're gonna start with a few things. We hear a lot about being data driven. There's more information available than ever before, so at what point does all the data start creating confusion instead of clarity? So I just wanted to start with the data overload because it's a hot topic right now. And this is information flooded when it comes to AI. So just wanted to have a perspective from that. And then we're going to discuss about the voice of customers, the scale of the market research as well.
Excellent. Yeah, my wife actually works in the translation industry for a large hospital, and I think that kind of gets to the root of that issue with data. I think it's pretty immediate when people find the issue, find the problem because there's there's an overload for human consumption of data almost immediately. And in the translation space, they say, hey, it's lost in translation, right? And that's what we get a lot of times with AI models that don't have proper sourcing, or the individuals aren't wise to the domain or the judgment to be able to deliver exactly what happened or where it came from. And so that seems to be a big problem with a lot of our clients today. They're just missing the connectivity and the intimacy that's necessary to be able to make decisions and feel confident in those decisions.
So, Josh, what do you think the organizations right now, for example, the Mara Group as well, because you work as a strategy role, help out the companies, corporates. Where do you think the organizations confuse having more data with actually understanding their customers better?
Yeah, I think this happens often. There are so many different sources of data today. And as you mentioned at the Martec Group, we support Fortune 1000s and support private equity investors. And so data is frequently coming from first party data like POS systems and tracking and advertising platforms. We also have rented databases that have contact information and firmographics, secondary reports. We have all the primary research that is a component of what we're talking about. So we have transcripts and results from surveys. And then we have all of this proprietary data that custom shops like Martech would have, in their back office database that they can pull from, as well as the knowledge base that clients have internally if they have a nice research library, which is quite rare, right? But I think that there are many times when decision makers at the senior leadership level need to get to the root of a problem. And the fastest way would be to either ask customers or pull direct information from customer transcripts and get to the root of the issue and make a switch decision that actually has to do with the behaviors, the intent, the needs, the wants, and the direction that is held in that very precious customer information. And instead, they're looking in all the wrong places. They're trying to sort through these massive reams of data. And it's not to say that all of that context isn't really important. It's just that we have tools today that will quantify qualitative data, that will take quantitative data and crunch it faster than you can say go. And so that information already exists. I think what a lot of my clients find is there are two really big black boxes that become a problem. One of them is, and I'd mentioned before, sometimes a researcher doesn't really understand where the information came from or how the conclusion was created from the information that's available. And if that's the case, then it's not going to stand up to scrutiny. You can't stand in front of a group and say, you should buy this company or not, or you should proceed with this product. if you don't know exactly why the truth that you're bringing into that room is correct. And I think the second black box is each of those actual micro experiences that the customer has. Probably the most tangible example there would be when you think about customer journey. Everyone's mapping the customer journey, and from an analytics standpoint, you can tell how many people visited a page, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is between visiting that page and visiting the store, or before visiting that page, there are so many steps between understanding, being interested in any particular industry, all the way to becoming a raving fan of a brand. And many of those steps is where the magic happens. That's where we need to talk to the customer and say, all right, here's the scenario. You're standing in front of the store. You've driven to the store. Why are you making this decision? What are you concerned about? What do you feel? What do you think? What would have made this decision different for you if they decided away from your brand, right? Each of those triggers holds a lot of value if you can get to the truth of how that customer actually feels and how that customer is actually making that decision. What's their buying criteria in that moment? And that just isn't in the first party data.
Right. I think it's a very valid point, and I'll ask this as well, because we've got all this AI and advanced analytics going on. Why does simply listening to customers, like in these times, like it's a transition from generative AI to the agentic AI? Why does listening to customers still is making a huge difference?
Yeah, I think back to an example that I had. We work a lot in the franchise space, and we were actually working for a youth enrichment company, rather large. And this one customer conversation changed the entire way we thought about the analytical model of how to go to market. So, first thing we did, we talked to the agency, we got all the details on their advertising. They were entering several different locations. We're looking into new locations, trying to understand what's the competitive set, what's the size of this market, what are the key positioning statements and language that work with these customers. And when we were doing the call to really get the instrument right, because every time before you go into quant, you ought to know exactly how a person's going to interact with that quant. So
Yeah.
talk to them, right? We always recommend talking to them first. And so we actually talked to some customers before we even went into the quant. And one of them said, listen, I don't care about how many miles it is. I care how many minutes it is for my family to drive my child to this place. That's the key difference. And that was a foundational moment for us. When we heard that, we changed the way we thought about the advertising domain for every one of those locations. We changed the way that we thought about interacting when we were creating the survey, how we were going to ask about it in drive time, not miles, right? And then measure that out. And that changed the way that we approached a big market like New York or Chicago, where that space is very, very tight versus, rural Michigan. And so just those conversations can unveil much more quickly something that is at the root of a problem. And it's also, I think, very successful, measure to go on the back end of quant and say, okay, we understand these generalizable truths, right, about this market. We understand that these insights are true, but for the person where it's true, what does it mean? And how are they considering making a new decision because of that? And so oftentimes after we do a big survey, we'll have found out a few things about the market, not just, segmentation persona typing tool, but we'll have asked specific questions about different triggers, and we'll understand, key decision points and so on. And after that, we will usually go back to those same people, or at least the same type of person, and say, we found out that people are doing this. Are you that person? And if they are, then we'll have a long form conversation with them. And that allows us to flesh out and create direct evidence for that boardroom. Now, when we go into the stakeholder, the key leadership stakeholders, instead of just saying, here's the, insight that we found out about the market, we say, here's the insight that we found out about the market. Now, here's how it matters to Margaret, right? And then we show a video of Margaret saying that and then explaining why she feels the way she does and what she's going to do about it. And we put that transcript into a one pager in a report, it really makes it real, and that's a key role for companies that support insights, is being the guardian of that voice and kind of bringing it like a present into those rooms.
Right. And I think like understanding the like those true metrics and translating it into the meaning as well is very important, because there's a difference between tracking those metrics and truly understanding your customers. How do you think, like when working with organizations, how do you think organizations move from measuring behavior to understanding the real motivation of the customers?
Well, I hope that I'm going to answer this right, because I'm not sure if if my examples will ring true, but there are a couple of the most important um, foundational shifts that I think organizations make that make the customer's voice a little bit more important. So the first one is they commit to some type of loyalty loop. So many of our clients over the years have gone in and done some type of brand health assessment. They've set up some type of CX program, given ownership, in whatever operating system like EOS, to someone to say, you're responsible for the voice of the customer. And that does make a big difference. And when they get those results back, you can change outcomes. For example, if you have a lot of different units and you need to increase your amount of marketing spend, that's going to impact all of those different operators. So if you can show them that the brand equity, what the brand equity is, what the brand awareness and penetration is and how it's changed, that can give them a lot more confidence in increasing that budget, knowing that they're going to get an ROI. But we do see sometimes clients will fall down on tracking, right? And they might fall down on creating some type of loyalty loop there. And so a couple things that they could do that really improve the outcome is commit to that tracking. Whether it's in a B2B space, maybe it's every 2 years or 3 years. In some B2C spaces, maybe you need a pulse that goes every quarter. But committing to tracking that longitudinally and saying, we do care as an organization exactly how this metric is going, and we're going to track it and commit to it, and we're going to move it, that makes a big difference. The other thing that I will find sometimes makes a strong impact in these programs is repackaging the research results, what was done about it from an action standpoint, and then giving that back to the customer. Right? It's like saying, I'm listening. Like if you're in a conversation and there's no back and forth at all,
Yeah.
then there might not be listening going on.
Yeah. So I hear this a lot because I have a question, like what are some signs that a company is collecting a customer feedback, but they're not actually listening to the real customers? Because you get to know this when you're at the end of the research and we've already spent like thousands of bucks, and that's a real problem. Like for the corporates, they're collecting the customer feedback, but they're not listening to the actual customers. And that's a difference between, of course, I'm going to more detail, like scaling through a large quantitative data versus more on the qualitative aspect of it. We would love to have your insights into this.
So this happens a lot, and I didn't coin this term, but this is a pretty popular term in the insights space and market research space, the research graveyard, right? That's what you want to avoid. And so often there's research that's done, and it is looked at by one or two people in the insights team, and then it dies, and no one ever gets to see it again. No action is taken, and that's a great tragedy. There's no need for that type of waste. And although it's hard, what we, at Martec and many other, similar organizations, what we try to do is take responsibility right up front for having those difficult preliminary conversations. So we have a requirement for most of our studies where we'll go in and say, we're going to have stakeholder calls, or we're going to have a large scale workshop. And in either of those cases, we're pulling in the senior leadership, whoever's the person that's going to make the decision. because research should always be tied to a decision, right? You should make at least one, and that decision could be buy, partner, build, or it could be, how are we going to upgrade this product, or what are we going to do better for our customers. But whoever that business leader is, and oftentimes it might be a product manager, sometimes it's the CEO or the CMO, but we get them in a call or in that room for the workshop and ask them right up front before any outside primary research is done, what are you going to decide? What do you want? What are your I wish I knew items, throughout this research? Because if that person's bought in, and they will be by the time they're done with that conversation with us, when they see the report at the end, they're not like, what's this? And where's all
Yeah.
these additional insights I wanted to see? Because being having that level of cohesion between the stakeholders and whoever's running the research and whoever might be, supplementing that externally is pretty critical to driving real action.
Right. And I think my last question is like, that really depends on the depth of, the research study, right? So I've seen organizations, they rely heavily on large scale surveys, dashboards. So how do you balance, like, at Martech, how do you balance scalable insights with more qualitative, like, the voice of customer, so that you understand the motivation behind that study as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's often debated, how to do that. I think about the most typical or most popular type of study might deal with a couple core problems, and it might have some combination of qualitative and quantitative. And the temptation for many companies is to rush just to doing a survey and run that survey as cheaply as possible and see what happens.
Yeah.
That's not good. Our ideal for a typical case like that is to do a miniature qualitative version up front and to do a larger scale qualitative on the back end after we do a large scale survey or whatever other quantitative, unless the methods dictate us having a very large scale qualitative to cover, because that's the most appropriate way to handle that market. But when we do a qual, what we're looking to do on the front end is to have conversations directly with the people that will be in the survey. And we're doing cognitive testing, linguistic testing. We're testing the stimuli with them. We're making sure that we've got trick questions to make sure that we get the right people in the survey. So all of those initial conversations are to deeply and firmly ground the research team and the client in who the customer is today, right before they're about to see the survey. And that creates such a great instrument. You could go way off with your survey instrument if you don't know who you're talking to. So that's why we try to do it up front. But that could be pretty small. Maybe that's only 10 people that we do that with. On the back end, that's where it's critical, because after you have accomplished a large scale survey, you should have statistical significance for the particular population that you're looking to understand, and you should have outputs that are driven from the beginning and clear insights that you want to deliver. And the next step is, how do you make that a real tangible deliverable, and how do you understand the why, and the behavioral aspects, and the feelings, and the emotions, and everything else about these particular decisions, the mechanics of those decisions, where do they happen, why do they happen, all of that is going to be coming from the qual. So you can now access that same person or that same type of person and get them on the horn for a video or a focus group, or a diet or triad, an online immersive, or an in-depth interview, and you can have that conversation with them. And you can't ask the same questions in a survey, because we have to respect these people. It's very important that you respect your participants, because otherwise you're not going to get great data. And it's just a fundamental thing we should be doing, is caring about people in our industry, right? So you can't have a ton of open ends in a survey. It not only will it kill your response rate, but it kills that person's day, and it
Yeah.
kind of just ruins the survey fatigue is real. So
Yeah.
Because you can't get it there, you got to get it somewhere else. So use the right tool for the right situation.
Yeah, my next question is, of course, another problem. Like, even when you are able to gather the great market insights, the customer feedback, acting on them can be another challenge. And I think, like, at Martech, that's like, what you do and what you drive. So, like, in your opinion, what separates organizations that truly, embed voice of customer into the strategy from those that treat it as a reporting function?
Great question, and I'm not going to be able to cover all the different things that are best practices for those organizations, but I will mention one, and that's having an OS that allows for doing some type of real strategic planning with the outcome. So one of the main things that we'll do, and we do this for private equity firms when we're working for their portfolio companies, as soon as they have a hold period, right? So it's time to go. It's time to get yardage right away because you've only got so many years to really create a great return on that company. And so we'll get all the leadership in a room and do a strategic planning session, and we are able to facilitate that now with software, which is really critical because if you come out of one of those meetings and everyone talked about some nice stuff to do, that is not the goal. We try to use as many different techniques and frameworks as we can in there and document everything to show the agreement between that team around what action steps they're going to take next. And then ascribe that action step to a particular person that is accountable and responsible for taking that action. And they'll need to report at the next cadence for their company leadership. So I think that's a great way to go. And we've seen strategic workshops like that be a massive success for a lot of our clients. And that type of reporting, it doesn't just say, here are the go-to-market playbooks, here's your 100-day plan, and here are the particular action steps and who's responsible for them. But the other critical thing that we do there, which is something that we do in concert with a software company called Allevance, is that we provide the exact amount or level of agreement that the leadership team has and why, right? So it's all added up. It's really an advanced conjoint, but it's beautiful and it shows you exactly what that level of commitment is across the leadership.
Yeah. One last question before we wrap up, because, like, as this whole data and research ecosystem gets even more complex, like, with AI and with now agentic AI, what advice would you give leaders who want to ensure the customer's voice continues to, stay intact and cut through the noise?
You know, two things. One, I would really encourage everyone, both in companies as well as at service providers, to think about the correct buckets. So I think for every one of these, every single engagement that you have, you should be thinking about what signal do we have in a pattern of signal and then meaning and then action, right? And the signal is all the different types of data that we talked about. The signal could be the transcripts that we're getting, the output from the survey, POS data, data for geographic location data or GIS data, right? All of that is a signal, and without understanding that, there's no value. So the next level is meaning, and the meaning is what analytical models are you going to run on that signal. Have a good plan for that in advance. You probably don't know most of the things that are signal. Okay, so to be able to get to the solution that you want. But the final layer, which is the most important, is the action. So it builds from there. Figure out what are the signal you need. Get to the level where you have some true meaning, and then understand what action steps need to be taken because of that meaning, and you'll get to a great place. I think that is the best way to try to organize what can be done and what can't be done with AI, whether it's generative or agentic or multiple agentic that are single source. It's all great, and it can accelerate some of those things, but some of it's just not suited for right now. And then I think that the advice that I would give to anyone that is running an insights team and supporting corporate researchers or supporting direct leadership is just to be the guardian of the voice of the customer. Think of it as a present that you're bringing in and one that only you can provide because it's a very labor intensive, very complicated thing to do to find a rare audience that is the only person that's bought or sold that thing that day, right? Get them on the horn, describe things to them, earn their trust, and have a discussion where you uncover specific information and then deliver that back to the brand. That's your responsibility, and that's the most important thing you could do. And every organization that we've worked with that builds greater intimacy with their customers and greater understanding with their customers and just seeks always to get closer and closer, they're the ones that win the best.
Right. Josh, this is helpful. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your perspective. To be honest, it's a great reminder that even with all this data and AI happening, having a conversation with your customer is still alive, right? So, and yeah, to everyone tuning in, thanks for listening to the Desk Talks by the Insights Desk. We'll see you in the next episode. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.